HOA cops arrested my sister, but panics when Secret Service shows up. Entitled People, before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Lena Thompson had always considered herself a regular person, a 24-year-old graphic designer living in a small, quiet, suburban town. She had a simple, unassuming life. Her days were filled with routine, waking up to the smell of fresh coffee brewing, scrolling through social media on her phone, and heading to work in the early mornings to get ahead of deadlines. Most evenings, she'd relax with a good book or a Netflix series, her only real excitement coming from hanging out with friends on weekends. Nothing about Lena's life suggested she would ever find herself in the middle of a criminal investigation, but that's exactly where she was headed one fateful Thursday afternoon. It started innocently enough. She was at a coffee shop enjoying her usual iced latte and catching up on some emails. But as she was getting ready to leave, a police officer entered, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. At first, Lena thought nothing of it. Maybe he was there for his own coffee break, or perhaps just another customer. But then the officer approached her table. "Lena Thompson?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a firmness that caught her attention. She looked up, confused. "Yes?" The officer continued, showing her a badge. "I need you to come with me. You're under arrest." Lena froze. "What? Arrested for what?" she asked, her mind racing. She hadn't broken any laws, had she? She hadn't even been involved in anything that could be remotely considered criminal. The officer didn't provide much explanation, just repeating that she needed to come with him. Lena, still stunned, stood up and followed. She glanced around, hoping someone would step in and clarify that this was all just a misunderstanding. But no one did. Her phone was left on the table, the iced latte now abandoned. Outside, another officer was waiting by a squad car. As Lena was handcuffed and placed in the back seat, the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had no idea what was happening, only that this felt like a bad dream. The ride to the station was quiet, and Lena's mind was in overdrive, trying to piece together any situation that might have led to this moment. Nothing came to mind. Her life had been smooth sailing, or so she thought. It wasn't until they arrived at the station that things took an unexpected turn. As Lena was being processed, a second car pulled up. This one wasn't a local police vehicle, but a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Lena noticed the officers around her stiffen as the new arrivals stepped out. Men in sharp suits, their presence unmistakable. They were Secret Service agents. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Why were they here? What did they have to do with her? The confusion multiplied. She couldn't understand how a simple arrest over what seemed like a minor issue had drawn the attention of federal agents. But there they were, walking toward her, their eyes scanning the room with a level of seriousness that made her stomach twist. Lena had never been in trouble with the law before, so when the officer first approached her, her mind couldn't make sense of it. She glanced around the coffee shop, half expecting to see someone else the officer was talking to, but no one else seemed to be bothered by his presence. The other patrons continued their conversations, oblivious to the unfolding situation. The officer's gaze was fixed on her, though, his demeanor serious and unyielding. "Are you sure there's some mistake?" Lena asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to keep it steady. "I'm not involved in anything. I understand, ma'am," the officer interrupted, his voice calm but firm, "but I need you to come with me. We've been instructed to take you into custody." Her heart began to race. She felt her hands go clammy as the officer guided her out of her seat. "I don't understand. What am I being arrested for?" Lena asked again, her voice quieter now. Was it some sort of misunderstanding? Had she unknowingly committed some minor infraction? Maybe a parking ticket she didn't remember paying? Nothing she could think of made sense. The officer didn't respond, just motioned for her to step out the door. Lena hesitated, then stood up, her legs shaking. The quiet clinking of coffee cups and murmurs of conversation from the other tables were drowned out by the thumping of her heart. She followed him outside, still too stunned to think straight. Once outside, she was met by a second officer who was already standing near a squad car. The cold air hit her face, but it barely registered as she was gently but firmly guided toward the back of the police car. Lena tried to process what was happening as she sat in the back seat, her head spinning. This had to be some sort of mistake, right? She hadn't done anything wrong. Was this a case of mistaken identity? But no one had explained anything to her. She couldn't wrap her mind around why she was in handcuffs, sitting in a police car, headed who knows where. It all felt surreal. "Can I at least call my brother?" Lena asked after a few moments, her voice small. "I don't understand what's going on." The officer in the front seat glanced at her through the rearview mirror but didn't respond immediately. After a tense silence, he muttered, "We'll sort it out at the station." "Don't worry." Lena sank into the seat, trying to calm her breathing, but her mind was racing. She was already starting to feel the weight of the situation, the uncertainty, the confusion, the sharp sting of fear that had taken over her chest. She wished she had some answers, some clue as to why this was happening. But there was nothing. No explanations, no details, only silence and the rhythmic hum of the squad car. As the car turned down a narrow street, Lena's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden screech of tires. In the rearview mirror, she saw another vehicle pull up behind them. It was a sleek black SUV, its dark windows giving it an almost ominous look. The car wasn't local, Lena could tell. It didn't have any of the usual police markings or insignia. The officer in the front seat stiffened at the sight of the SUV. Lena watched him exchange a quick, sharp look with his partner. The SUV's headlights flashed briefly before the vehicle pulled up beside the squad car. The doors opened, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. The men who stepped out weren't wearing typical police uniforms. They were dressed in dark suits, their ties perfectly knotted, their movements deliberate and professional. Secret Service agents. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The officers who had been escorting Lena seemed to shrink in their roles as they turned to address the newcomers. It was as if the situation had just escalated into something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The tension in the air was thick, and the officers looked nervous. Lena's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a simple arrest anymore. This wasn't just some minor misunderstanding. The presence of these federal agents meant something far bigger than she could have imagined. "What's going on?" she whispered under her breath, her voice a mix of confusion and growing panic. No one answered her. The agents moved toward her, their eyes scanning the scene with sharp intensity, and suddenly it wasn't just about her. It felt like she had become a part of something much larger, something she had no control over. Lena sat in the holding room at the police station, her hands still trembling in the cold metal cuffs. She had barely been allowed to speak to anyone since her arrest, and her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The officers had barely spoken a word to her beyond the initial arrest. But now, as the minutes dragged on, she noticed the change in the air. The tension between the local officers and the Secret Service agents had become palpable. They weren't just here for her. They were here for something, or someone, bigger. The sound of hushed voices echoed from the corridor, the sharp tones of the agents mixing with the calmer, less urgent voices of the local officers. Lena strained to hear, but couldn't make out the words. She wanted to ask them what was happening, why this was all happening, but no one seemed willing to tell her. Then the door opened, and one of the Secret Service agents stepped in. His suit was immaculate, and his expression remained unreadable as he glanced at her. "Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice low, "I'm Agent Reynolds. We're going to get to the bottom of this, but I need to ask you a few questions." Lena nodded slowly, her throat dry. "I don't know what's going on. I didn't do anything. Agent Reynolds raised a hand, silencing her. "It's not about what you did, Ms. Thompson. It's about who you're connected to. Do you know anything about a man named Jason McAllister?" The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze, her mind racing. Jason McAllister. The name was familiar, but only in passing. He had been someone her brother David had mentioned a few times. David and Jason used to work together in some sort of business venture, though Lena never paid much attention. Jason was always in the background of their conversations, a shadowy figure whose presence didn't make much sense to her. I know him," she replied carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. "He was a friend of my brother's, but I haven't spoken to him in a long time." Agent Reynolds didn't react, but his eyes were studying her closely. "Your brother David hasn't been in touch with McAllister for months, but recently your name surfaced in connection with an investigation involving McAllister's business dealings. It appears that you've been in contact with him, albeit indirectly. Lena's head was spinning. Wait, what are you talking about? I haven't spoken to him in ages. The only reason I even know his name is because of my brother. Agent Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded to another agent who had been standing at the door, motioning for him to bring over a file. The agent placed the file on the table in front of Lena and opened it, revealing a series of phone records, emails, and even a few transaction logs. Lena's eyes widened as she saw her name, her personal number, listed on several pages. You've been in contact with McAllister, Lena, Agent Reynolds continued, his voice steady but firm. Not directly, but through a series of communications involving his business transactions. He used you, or at least your name, to move certain pieces around without drawing attention. You've unknowingly become a part of something much larger than you realize. Lena stared at the papers in front of her, disbelief spreading through her body. She couldn't make sense of it. Her phone number had been listed in connection with some shady transactions. She had never once been involved in anything illegal. How had her name ended up in the mix? And why had no one told her? Her mind flashed back to a few months ago, when she had agreed to help David set up a new phone for him. It had seemed innocent enough at the time, a simple favor to make sure his old phone was wiped clean. She couldn't have known it would lead to anything like this. The door swung open again, and a local officer stepped inside, his face tense. He exchanged a brief glance with Agent Reynolds and then turned his attention to Lena. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension as the two law enforcement factions seemed to square off silently. Lena's mind was still reeling, but now she could feel it. The stark difference between how the local officers handled the situation and how the Secret Service agents carried themselves. The local officers, who had been calm and collected when the arrest was first made, now seemed uncertain. They were hesitant, not quite sure how to proceed with such high-level federal agents in the mix. It was as if they were trying to tread carefully, not wanting to step on anyone's toes, but clearly aware that the presence of the Secret Service meant they had no real authority in this situation. I didn't do anything, Lena repeated softly, her voice cracking. The shock was starting to settle into a cold, oppressive fear. I'm just a graphic designer. I don't even know what Jason McAllister does. I swear I didn't know anything about any of this. Agent Reynolds met her gaze, his eyes unreadable. You're involved, whether you realize it or not, and we'll get to the bottom of it. But right now, we need to move quickly. There are people trying to cover their tracks, and you're the one they're trying to use to do it. The words hung heavy in the air. As the Secret Service agents and local officers exchanged a few terse words, Lena could feel the gravity of the situation closing in on her. This was no longer about her. This was about something far bigger. And she had somehow found herself right in the middle of it. Lena's phone buzzed just moments after the door closed behind the Secret Service agents, the screen flashing her brother David's name. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been able to get in touch with anyone since her arrest, and the panic that had started to rise in her chest was only getting worse. David picked up before the third ring. Lena, what's going on? We've been trying to get a hold of you all day. We heard something happened, but nobody's giving us a straight answer. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a shaky breath. Her voice felt thick in her throat, and she could barely force the words out. David, I don't know what's happening. I'm in some kind of trouble. I'm at the police station. David was silent for a moment, and she could hear the confusion on his end. Trouble? What kind of trouble? Are you okay? What happened? Lena could hear the tension in his voice as he tried to piece things together. She could feel it too, the cold weight of uncertainty that pressed down on her chest. I don't know. I don't even understand it. The police showed up at the coffee shop, and then the Secret Service. David, they're involved now. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, the realization of her involvement in something so serious hitting her harder with every sentence. David didn't respond right away, and Lena knew he was probably processing the absurdity of it all. The silence on the line felt suffocating. Finally, David spoke, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The Secret Service? What the hell is going on, Lena? You've got to be kidding me. This doesn't make sense. I swear, I don't know. I didn't do anything. I didn't even know I was connected to any of this. Lena's voice cracked with frustration, and the tears she'd been holding back started to spill. I need help, David. I don't know what to do. They won't even tell me what I'm being arrested for. David's voice softened, but there was still a sharp edge to it. We'll get you out of there. Just to stay calm, all right? I'll call Mom and Dad. We're going to figure this out. I'm coming down to the station. I'll be there soon. Lena nodded even though he couldn't see her. It wasn't much comfort, but she clung to his words. David was always the one who handled things, who knew what to do in emergencies. But this was different. She didn't know how any of them could handle something so far out of their realm of understanding. The phone call ended quickly, and Lena was left with the hollow echo of her brother's words. She couldn't help but wonder how they'd react when they found out the full scope of what was happening, when they learned about her inadvertent link to Jason McAllister in the federal investigation. Meanwhile, David wasn't the only one trying to make sense of the situation. Lena's parents, Susan and Charles, had also been hit with the shock of their lives when they received the call from David. Susan, who had always been the more vocal of the two, immediately burst into tears. Charles, usually the more reserved, paced the living room, phone clutched in one hand as he tried to make calls to local attorneys. What do you mean the Secret Service is involved? What does she have to do with that? Susan's voice was raw, her worry evident in every syllable. I don't know, Susan, Charles replied, his words coming out in short bursts. But this is serious. We need to find out exactly what's going on. We can't just sit here and wait for them to sort this out. The situation was unlike anything they had ever dealt with. Their daughter, Lena, their quiet, responsible, level-headed daughter, caught up in something they couldn't even understand. Their minds raced through possible explanations, none of which made sense. A simple graphic designer, a woman who had no criminal record, no previous history of trouble. How did she get involved with federal agents? David, true to his word, arrived at the station as quickly as he could. He walked straight to the front desk, trying to get any information he could about Lena's situation, but the officers were tight-lipped. They offered no answers and seemed unwilling to share details beyond the bare minimum. His frustration grew as he was handed off to one attorney after another, all of them spinning the situation in different directions. Each lawyer seemed more interested in charging him a hefty retainer fee than actually offering any useful advice. David was left feeling helpless. How could he protect his sister when even the people supposed to help were focused more on the financial side of things? Back at home, Susan couldn't sit still. She paced around the house, picking up and putting down the same objects over and over again, her anxiety eating at her from the inside. I don't understand, she muttered, looking at Charles. What's happening to our little girl? How did we miss something like this? Charles, though clearly shaken, remained focused on finding a solution. He called a few trusted contacts, people he'd known for years. Maybe they could get the right kind of lawyer, someone who had experience dealing with cases that involved federal authorities. He needed answers, fast. By the time the sun began to set, the whole family was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear, each of them grappling with the sudden, inexplicable shift in their lives. No one had the full picture yet. No one understood how Lena's life had collided with the federal investigation or what consequences awaited her. But they all knew one thing for sure. They weren't going to let her face it alone. The days that followed Lena's arrest felt like an unending blur of uncertainty. After David had managed to secure a highly recommended defense attorney, they began navigating the labyrinth of legal procedures. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria Caldwell, wasted no time in getting to work. She met with Lena as soon as possible, sitting across from her in the small, sterile room of the holding facility where Lena had been placed after her initial booking. Let's get one thing straight, Lena, Maria began, her voice steady and professional. The situation you're in is delicate. With the Secret Service involved, this is no longer just a simple local matter. Federal authorities don't get involved unless they suspect something far larger, and that's something we need to figure out. Lena nodded, trying to absorb the weight of the words, though the anxiety pressing in her chest made it hard to focus. Maria laid out the general course of action, starting with filing for bail, then securing preliminary hearings, and ensuring that they would have access to all the evidence against her. But the more Maria explained, the more Lena felt the walls closing in. Every step felt like a climb, each more difficult than the last. We'll need to see what the Secret Service is actually accusing you of, Maria continued. They've linked your name to a series of communications involving a person named Jason McAllister. But you haven't been formally charged yet, which is good. For now, we need to stick to the basics. Get you released on bail, and then start digging into the details. Lena was barely listening anymore, her mind swimming in a haze of confusion. I don't understand. I've told you everything I know about McAllister. I've barely even spoken to him in years. What do they think I've done? Maria gave her a sympathetic glance, her eyes softening for a brief moment. I know it's hard, Lena, but the fact that the Secret Service is involved means there's more to this than you realize. They aren't here for a minor misunderstanding. They believe you're somehow connected to something much bigger. I can't tell you what that is yet, but we'll get to the bottom of it. The next few weeks were filled with trips to the courthouse, endless paperwork, and more consultations with Maria, who had to navigate the intricacies of federal law and local legal proceedings. With every conversation, Lena learned more about the complexities she now faced, but it only made her feel more isolated. The federal agents weren't just interested in the details of Lena's communication with McAllister. They were probing her every move, combing through her past, looking for any shred of evidence that could link her to an illegal network. Maria had warned her that this kind of investigation could go deep, and with the Secret Service's reach, it was likely to get worse before it got better. During one of the hearings, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lena sat next to Maria, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the chair, her mind racing. As the judge laid out the potential charges against her, it felt like the floor was slipping out from under her. A federal investigation meant higher stakes, more scrutiny. If they found anything that linked her to McAllister's operations, if they could prove she had been knowingly involved, even passively, the consequences could be far worse than she had imagined. Do you really think they have enough to charge me? Lena whispered to Maria, her voice barely audible over the hum of the courtroom. Maria hesitated before answering. I'm not sure, but what I do know is that the more we can show that you had no idea what was going on, the better. The issue here is the connection, Lena. Not what you did, but what you might have unknowingly been a part of. That was the hardest part for Lena to grasp. How could she be held accountable for something she didn't even know was happening? But the deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the law didn't care about her intentions. They cared about connections, about patterns, about who knew who, and who might have benefited from illicit activities, even by association. As the weeks passed, Lena's anxiety began to take a physical toll. She wasn't sleeping well, her appetite had all but disappeared, and she found herself withdrawing from everyone around her. Even talking to her family became harder. Her parents were constantly worried. David was trying to stay calm but wasn't hiding his own fear, and Lena could feel the weight of their concern pressing down on her. Every time they spoke, it felt like they were all walking on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing, as if their every word could send her deeper into this nightmare. The emotional strain became almost unbearable. At night, Lena would lie awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together how she'd gotten here. It didn't make sense. She couldn't reconcile the person she knew herself to be with the woman sitting in front of a courtroom, her life now a mess of legal jargon and federal intrigue. And then there were the secret meetings with the Secret Service. As if the investigation wasn't complicated enough, the agents had started to approach her in increasingly subtle ways. An unmarked car following her when she left court hearings, a quiet knock on her door when she was alone at home. More questions that seemed to lead nowhere. It felt like they were watching her every move, trying to force her into a corner where she would say something, anything, that could give them the evidence they were looking for. Maria warned her that this was a tactic often used in cases involving the Secret Service. Silent pressure to get a confession, or at least a statement that could be twisted into something incriminating. Lena had to fight the temptation to break under the pressure, to say something to make it stop. Some nights, she wanted to give up, to stop fighting, to just let everything unfold. But the thought of facing whatever was coming without a fight, of letting her family down, was too much. So she held on even as the emotional toll grew heavier with each passing day, each new challenge, and each new piece of information she learned about the web she was now caught in. It didn't take long for the news of Lena's arrest to spread. Within hours, the story was picked up by local news outlets, and before long, it went viral. Headlines screamed her name, her face flashed on TV screens, and every new update seemed to paint her as a criminal, caught up in some shadowy federal investigation. She hadn't even been formally charged yet, but the media was already painting her as the villain in a story she didn't understand. Local graphic designer linked to major federal investigation, screamed one headline. Secret Service zeroes in on suspected criminal ties, shouted another. Social media was quick to follow suit, with rumors swirling and wild theories being shared at lightning speed. Strangers weighed in with their opinions, condemning her without a second thought. They didn't know her. They didn't know anything about her, yet they judged her all the same. Lena sat in her apartment one night, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting off her tired face as she scrolled through the endless posts and articles. Her name was everywhere, but none of it felt real. The headlines twisted her actions, misrepresented her involvement, and turned her into something she wasn't. In one article, she was referred to as a suspected accomplice in a massive criminal enterprise. In another, they claimed she had been caught red-handed in illegal dealings. It was a far cry from the person she knew herself to be. A graphic designer, a quiet woman who loved coffee shops and late-night movies, who had never been in trouble before. But in the eyes of the public, Lena had already been judged, tried, and found guilty, all based on a few scattered facts and half-formed conclusions. The scrutiny wasn't just confined to the internet or the news. People she had once called friends started to distance themselves. Texts went unanswered, calls were ignored. Some of them had seen the news and assumed the worst. They didn't reach out to ask for an explanation. They just moved on, turning their backs on a person they thought they understood. The whispers, the sideways glances, it was all too much. But the most difficult part was seeing her family suffer from it too. Her parents especially were devastated. They were living in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and Lena's arrest was the talk of the community. The constant questions, the looks they received when they stepped outside, the pity in people's eyes. It was too much for them to bear. Susan would try to maintain her composure, but it was clear to anyone who saw her that she was broken. The emotional toll of seeing her daughter's name dragged through the mud was too much. Her hands would shake as she tried to respond to calls, her voice trembling as she spoke to people who had no idea what was really going on. I know my daughter, she would say over and over, and she's not what they're saying. This is all a mistake. David, too, struggled. He had spent so much time trying to protect his sister, trying to shield her from this public nightmare, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with his bare hands. He organized press conferences trying to clarify the situation, but every time he spoke, the media twisted his words. There's more to this than what you're hearing, he would tell them. My sister is innocent. She's not part of any criminal operation. You'll see. Just wait. But the more David defended Lena, the more the press focused on him. He wasn't just Lena's brother anymore. He became part of the story. His past with Jason McAllister, the connections he had to people involved in the case, all of it was dug up and placed under a microscope. Reporters camped out at his house, knocking on his door at all hours, trying to get a soundbite. His life, too, was being consumed by the media frenzy. And then there was the constant tug-of-war between privacy and the public's insatiable curiosity. The media wanted details. They wanted to know everything. What had Lena known? Who was she really involved with? Was she a pawn, or was she a willing participant in whatever scheme McAllister was running? They wanted answers, even if those answers were based on nothing but speculation. Lena's family tried to protect her from the worst of it. David spoke to the media on her behalf as much as he could, but every interview felt like it made things worse. The media didn't want explanations. They wanted drama. They wanted scandal. The more David tried to reassure everyone, the more the headlines seemed to spin out of control. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about the story, the narrative that the public was hungry for. Lena's parents wanted to shut out the world. They wanted to retreat into their home, to lock the doors and never let anyone in again. But they couldn't. The world had already invaded their lives, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. Every time they opened the door, There were reporters on the porch, neighbors offering unsolicited opinions, and strangers staring at them like they were characters in a tragic story. In the midst of all this chaos, Lena couldn't help but feel completely alone. The people who knew her, truly knew her, were few and far between. The rest of the world saw her as a headline, a punchline, a name that was easy to villainize. And with each passing day, it felt like the walls of her privacy were crumbling. Her reputation was being torn apart in front of her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. All she could do was wait and hope that somehow, through the noise and the distortion, the truth would eventually make its way to the surface. Lena sat in her apartment late one evening, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space. The weight of everything that had happened felt like a suffocating fog. She stared at the half-finished glass of water in front of her, wondering how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. The reality of her situation was hard to grasp. A month ago, she had been living a normal life. Now she was at the center of a federal investigation, her name plastered across the news, her every move being scrutinized. The truth was, she hadn't done anything wrong, not in the way everyone seemed to think. She'd never been involved in anything illegal, had never knowingly crossed any lines. Her life had been simple. She designed websites, attended book club meetings, caught up with friends over coffee, the kind of life that people could easily overlook. So how had it come to this? The first time Lena had met Jason McAllister was years ago, long before any of this chaos had begun. He was a friend of a friend, someone she'd run into at a couple of parties. At first, they barely exchanged more than pleasantries, but eventually their conversations became more frequent, and she learned that Jason had a background in tech and business. He was charming, a little too smooth for her taste, but always friendly. It wasn't until much later, when she started hearing rumors, that she realized how tangled he was in things that she had never known about. Lena had always considered herself a good judge of character, but she had been too trusting. She hadn't asked the right questions, hadn't paid attention to the signs. But even then, she never imagined that casual conversations with Jason would somehow lead to this. Federal agents knocking on her door, accusing her of being involved in a web of illegal activities she had never been a part of. It had started innocently enough. One evening, Jason had mentioned needing help with a design project for a new business venture. The kind of business that was always vague on details, but still, it was a paying job, and she needed the work. Lena didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't like she had been doing anything illegal. She was just designing a website. And yet somehow, that website became one of the key pieces of evidence that had linked her to the investigation. The misunderstanding had come from a simple, unintentional coincidence. Jason had used her design as a front for an operation that Lena had no idea about. The business he was launching wasn't what he had portrayed it to be. It wasn't just a tech startup. As Lena would later find out, it had ties to a much darker world. Money laundering, illegal transactions, and shady business dealings. But at the time, she had no clue. She was just doing her job, designing a website for what she thought was a legitimate business. The more Lena thought about it, the more she realized how blind she had been. She had been naive, trusting someone who had never shown his true colors. She had been caught up in something she hadn't asked for, a web of lies spun so tightly that she could barely see where it began and ended. And now she was the one being blamed for it. Her first conversation with the police had only confirmed how little they understood about her involvement. She had tried to explain it, to make them see that she was just a designer, a small player in a much bigger game. But the more she spoke, the more they seemed convinced of her guilt. The charges, the scrutiny, the way they looked at her like she was somehow complicit. It was all based on misunderstandings, on facts that didn't quite fit together. It was maddening. How could they think she was involved in something so sinister? She hadn't even known who Jason was really working with, let alone been a part of anything illegal. But in their eyes, it didn't matter. She had designed the website. She had been connected to the business. It was enough for them to start investigating her, to dig into her life, looking for any shred of evidence that would tie her to the criminal activities they were accusing her of. The federal interest was the worst part of it all. They were relentless, unyielding in their investigation. Secret Service agents showed up at her door, following her to her lawyer's office, watching her every move. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about what fit their narrative. They wanted someone to blame, and she had become the convenient scapegoat. Even her lawyer, Maria, had warned her that the longer this went on, the harder it would be to clear her name. The federal system was unforgiving, and once they had their sights set on someone, it was difficult to escape the downward spiral of suspicion. But Lena wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. Her family, her reputation, everything she had worked for, it was all on the line. She couldn't just stand by and let them ruin her life based on a misunderstanding. She knew she had to fight, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. It wasn't just about proving her innocence anymore. It was about reclaiming the life that had been taken from her, piece by piece, by a story she hadn't written. Each day she took one step at a time, fighting to uncover the truth. She worked with Maria, combing through every piece of evidence, trying to find something, anything, that would prove her connection to Jason was purely accidental. She was determined to expose the holes in the case against her, to show that the events that led to her entanglement were not what the authorities believed them to be. She thought of her family constantly, the way her mother cried every time they spoke on the phone, the way her father's voice shook when he tried to reassure her. They were as lost as she was, but they were her strength. They hadn't given up on her, and she wouldn't give up on them. The truth would come out. She had to believe that, because if she didn't, she would be swallowed by the lie that had been constructed around her, and Lena was done being the victim. It was time to take back control of her story, to show everyone who she really was. The day Lena had been waiting for finally arrived. The courtroom was filled with tension as everyone took their seats, the air thick with anticipation. Lena's heart raced as she glanced at her family sitting in the back row, her mother's hand clutched tightly in her father's. They had been through so much, and now it was all coming to a head. The charges that had loomed over her like a dark cloud for months were about to be addressed, and for the first time in weeks, Lena allowed herself to hope. Just a little. Maria, her defense attorney, had worked tirelessly to dismantle the case against her. Every piece of evidence that had been used to implicate her had been thoroughly examined, and the holes in the prosecution's argument were impossible to ignore. The website she had designed for Jason McAllister, once the center of the investigation, was revealed to be nothing more than a simple business design project, something Lena had done for a client she barely knew. There was no criminal intent, no illicit activity on her part. In fact, the investigation had uncovered that McAllister himself had been using the website for his own purposes without Lena's knowledge. As the judge listened to the final arguments, Lena's nerves were on edge. She had been through so much, and the weight of the past months hung heavily in the air. The court proceedings had dragged on longer than she had expected, but Maria's careful handling of each detail had paid off. It was clear that the case against her was built on nothing more than assumptions, misunderstandings, and coincidences. When the judge finally spoke, the words felt like a rush of relief. The charges against Lena Roberts are hereby dismissed. The evidence presented does not support the allegations, and there is no basis for continuing this investigation. Lena blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. She heard the murmur of the crowd around her, but all she could focus on was the sound of her own breath, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. The past few months had been a blur of fear and confusion, but now in that moment, it was over. The truth had finally won. Her mother's sobs broke through her daze, and Lena turned to see her parents standing up, both with tears in their eyes. Her father's face was flushed with emotion, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. "We knew you weren't guilty," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We never doubted you." The family left the courthouse together. The weight of the world finally lifted from their shoulders. The outside world felt different now, brighter somehow, though the scars of the past few months would take time to fade. They walked side by side with Lena in the middle, feeling the strength of her family's support. It had been a long and painful journey, but the bonds between them had grown stronger, forged in the fire of adversity. At home, the house was quieter than it had been in months. Lena sat at the kitchen table, her parents on either side of her, the comforting familiarity of home wrapping around her like a blanket. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable now. They didn't need words to know how far they had come, how much they had been through, and how much they had learned. Her parents had been her rock throughout the ordeal. Despite the public judgment, despite the accusations and rumors, they never wavered in their belief in her. Even when the world had seemed to turn its back on Lena, they stood by her. They had weathered the storm together, and now they could finally begin to heal. But the journey wasn't over. Lena knew that while the legal battle was over, the emotional scars would take time to heal. The media had moved on, but the pain of being judged without cause still lingered. Trust had been shattered, not just with others, but with herself. She'd spent so many sleepless nights questioning her decisions, wondering if she should have known more, should have paid closer attention. She had learned the hard way that things were not always what they seemed, that people could hide their true intentions behind a friendly face. But as time passed, Lena came to understand that this was part of the lesson she needed to learn. Trust was important, but so was the ability to stand firm in your own truth, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise. She had fought to clear her name, but the true strength had come from the support of her family, the unwavering belief they had in her, even when she doubted herself. That was the real victory, the reminder that no matter what the world said, the people who mattered most were the ones who knew her heart. The months after the trial were spent rebuilding, not just her reputation, but the deeper connections that had been tested. Lena had become more aware of the fragility of relationships, how easily they could be broken by misunderstandings or assumptions. But she had also learned how to cherish the people who truly had her back, those who hadn't run when things got tough. Lena also began to reassess her own priorities. The experience had changed her. It had taught her to be more cautious, but also more empathetic, more understanding of the complexities in others' lives. She had learned that sometimes the truth wasn't so simple, and the people we trust may not always be who we think they are. Yet despite all the challenges, Lena remained hopeful, knowing that her family's love would always be her foundation. As they sat together at the kitchen table, Lena finally spoke. "I can't ever thank you enough for everything you've done," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You didn't give up on me, even when I wasn't sure if I could hold on. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "We're a family, Lena. We fight for each other, no matter what." And in that moment, Lena knew that no matter what the future held, she had everything she needed to face it: her family, her strength, and the lessons she had learned. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but she was no longer afraid. She had survived this, and with the support of the people who loved her, she would face whatever came next. Months had passed since the court ruling, and though the headlines had quieted, the echoes of Lena's ordeal still lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be erased or forgotten. The emotional scars remained, but they had started to take on a new shape, like worn stones smoothed by time. Lena had learned to navigate life differently now, with more caution, yes, but also with more understanding of what really mattered. She had spent the weeks after the trial rebuilding her sense of self, rebuilding her reputation, and most importantly, rebuilding her relationship with her family. Every day was a process of healing, sometimes slow and painstaking, but still a steady path forward. The legal victory had cleared her name, but it was the emotional recovery that took time. It wasn't just about overcoming the public shame or the media frenzy. It was about reconciling with the person she had become during the ordeal. Her perspective on people had changed, and not just in terms of trust. Before everything happened, Lena had often taken for granted the quiet, comfortable life she had. She had been content with her small circle, the predictability of her day-to-day, and the reassurance that nothing would disturb her peace. But in the face of adversity, she learned that peace was fragile. And though the ordeal had shaken her, it had also made her realize that she could handle more than she thought. She had strength she hadn't known was there. Strength she found in herself, and strength she drew from the love and support of her family. The incident also forced Lena to reevaluate her place in the world. The work she had once been passionate about, designing websites and building a brand, now felt secondary to the relationships she had with the people closest to her. Her life, once defined by career milestones and personal achievements, had become more about the connections she shared with others. Her parents, too, had changed in the wake of the ordeal. They had always been supportive, of course, but they had never known what it was like to stand in the eye of a storm like this. Watching them navigate the aftermath, Lena saw them in a new light. They were stronger than she'd realized, more resilient than she could have imagined. They didn't just shelter her from the outside world during her darkest moments. They fought alongside her, never letting go, never doubting for a second that the truth would come to light. David had become her closest confidant, more than just her older brother. They spent hours talking late into the night, unpacking what had happened, dissecting the twists and turns of their family's journey. He had always been her protector, but now he was someone she could turn to for understanding. Someone who knew exactly what it had been like to feel their lives being ripped apart. Their bond had deepened in a way that nothing else could have achieved. Together they'd weathered the storm, and together they were rebuilding, not just the pieces of Lena's life, but also the pieces of their shared history, the moments they'd lost during the chaos. The experience had also brought the family closer in ways that were hard to articulate. It was like they had all been tested, separately and together, and had come out on the other side stronger, more united. They had learned to be more patient with each other, more forgiving of flaws, and more aware of the fragility of life. There was no longer any room for taking one another for granted. Every conversation, every laugh, every dinner together was more meaningful than before. They had been through something that very few people would ever understand, and in that they found a kind of unspoken solidarity. In the quiet moments when the world felt still, Lena would reflect on everything she had gone through. She thought about how close she had come to losing it all, how everything she knew could have slipped away in the blink of an eye. But she also realized something vital. It wasn't the hard times that defined her, but the way she chose to rise above them. She hadn't chosen this battle, but she had chosen to keep fighting. The lessons she'd learned during the ordeal had transformed her. She no longer measured her worth by how well she fit into the boxes others created for her. She had learned the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for herself when the world was ready to write her off. The road ahead would have its own challenges, but Lena no longer feared them. Whatever life threw her way, she knew she had the strength to handle it because her family would always be there to support her. And so, with each passing day, Lena moved forward. She resumed her work, but now with a newfound purpose, no longer driven solely by ambition or the need to prove herself. Her relationships deepened, her family's bonds solidified, and her outlook on life evolved. The ordeal had shaped her, yes, but it had also shaped those around her. They had all grown, not just in strength, but in empathy, understanding, and love. When they gathered around the dinner table now, it wasn't just about the food or the small talk. It was about the deeper connection they shared. Lena looked around at her family, her heart full of gratitude. In the face of everything they'd endured, they had emerged not broken, but stronger. They had weathered the storm, and in doing so, had learned to cherish the very thing that had gotten them through it all: each other. Lena stood at the threshold of her new apartment, the soft morning light filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It felt surreal, like she was stepping into a new life, one that was finally her own after months of uncertainty. The weight of the past, of the arrest, the media frenzy, the long days in court, had started to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace that she hadn't realized she'd been longing for. The apartment was bare except for the essentials: a couch, a table, a few boxes stacked in the corner. It was simple, but it was hers, a place where she could begin to breathe again. As she unpacked the last of her things, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from her mom, followed by a picture of her and her dad, standing outside the house, both grinning. The message read, "We're all so proud of you, Lena. We love you. Can't wait to celebrate soon." Lena smiled, feeling the familiar warmth of her family's support wrap around her, even through the phone screen. Despite everything that had happened, they were still her anchor, the ones who had stood by her, lifting her up when she couldn't stand on her own. Even now they were excited for her, proud of her resilience. They had celebrated the victory, yes, but more than that, they were celebrating her strength, her ability to persevere and come out stronger on the other side. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a group message with David and her parents, setting a date for a small get-together at her new place. It was going to be a simple evening, just dinner, laughter, and the joy of being together. But it felt like a fresh start, the kind of start that Lena had almost given up on during the darkest days of the ordeal. She had thought that perhaps life would always be clouded by what had happened, that she would always carry the weight of the misunderstanding with her. But now, looking out at the bright horizon through her window, she realized that the past didn't have to define her. She could leave it behind. Lena had learned the hard way that life was unpredictable, that things could change in an instant, flipping everything you thought you knew upside down. But what had gotten her through the storm wasn't the certainty of the future, nor the promise of an easy path. It was the unwavering presence of her family. Their love had been the constant in the chaos, the thread that had held everything together when it felt like it might unravel. She took a deep breath, stepping into the living room, finally feeling the weight of everything she had survived settle into something new. A sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she knew she had the strength to face whatever would come next. She hadn't let the past break her, and that realization made her feel invincible in a way she had never known before. The sound of her phone chiming again broke the silence, but this time it was a reminder to herself. She had promised herself she would keep moving forward, keep embracing each new day, no matter what. As she glanced around the room, she felt the space finally feel like home, not just because it was a new place, but because it symbolized a new chapter. She wasn't running from her past, but she was learning to live beyond it. Later that evening, Lena stood with her family in her new apartment, the space filled with the sound of laughter and the clink of glasses. They toasted to new beginnings, to the strength they had found in each other, and to the bond that had only grown stronger through the trials they had faced. Lena glanced around at the faces she loved, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had never given up on her. Life was unpredictable. In an instant, everything could change. But Lena had learned something crucial. The real strength wasn't in trying to control the future, but in knowing that no matter what happened, she had the support of her family. Together, they could face anything. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt a sense of calm as she looked forward to whatever the future would bring.